Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, hello. And welcome to those physically here and those virtually here. Because if you didn't know it, you can also, or people are joining us online. We have enormous reach at the Wilson Center. I'm Jane Harmon, President and CEO, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a timely discussion about some of the major transformations happening in Africa today. This Ain't Your Granddaddy's Africa is one of the cooler titles ever, and it's an understatement. And before we start, I want to recognize at least two people who are here, and I'll probably forget the rest who are here, but Thelma Duggan is the interim chair of the Wilson Center Board and a longtime board member, and she is awesome. And I also want to recognize my former colleague, there she is, in front, my former colleague, Russ Carnahan. I don't know where Russ is. Is he here or is he outside? Sitting in the back. Okay, I know why. Who tells me that his grandfather was our first ambassador to Sierra Leone. Who knew? And who loved your title, Monday, so he had to be here. And so we've just been catching up on life and times in with our former employer. So today's conversation is part of our Brown Capital Management Africa Forum. We're very grateful to Brown Capital Management for their generous support, and welcome to the Wilson Center senior members of the Brown Capital Management team, including President and CEO Keith Lee, whom you'll hear from in a moment. The forum is a very special and important initiative for the Wilson Center. It allows us to convene business leaders, policymakers, practitioners, and subject matter experts for solution-oriented dialogue on Africa trade, economic, and development issues. Our Africa program, ably led by this Zambian-born Rhodes Scholar to my left, are you now all intimidated? Dr. Mande Miangwa, is Africa's go-to resource for understanding critical issues facing Africa and U.S.-Africa relations. The program addresses four main themes. First, good governance and leadership. Second, conflict prevention, peace building, and security. Third, trade investment and sustainable development. And not last, Africa's evolving role in the global arena. Our program staff, led by Mande, has just returned from a very successful two-day trip to Botswana on a matter of critical importance to Africa, the role of sovereign wealth funds in Africa's development. The meeting was opened by the president of Botswana and included a keynote by the vice president and treasurer of the World Bank. It was attended by CEOs of Africa's sovereign wealth funds, senior African officials, and other experts and stakeholders. This trip was the first time the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum was held an event outside the U.S., which demonstrates, no surprise to me, the global reach that the Brown gift makes possible for our Africa Center. Our conversation this afternoon will focus on highlighting and assessing some of the important transformations taking place in Africa across many sectors. First, from economics, with many African countries experiencing rapid economic growth while others once again risk the debt trap. Second, to governance, where efforts at democratization have had mixed results. And third, to security, where some long-standing conflicts are drawing down while new threats emerge. These changes offer both promise and peril for the continent, especially for young people who will have to live in the new Africa that emerges. Today, we have assembled a star panel of experts with a wide range of knowledge and experience to help us get to the bottom of what these transformations away from your granddaddy's Africa, maybe to your grandmother's future Africa, who knows, these transformations, positive and negative, mean for Africa and the rest of the world. In addition, we have asked our speakers to help identify some concrete ways for policymakers in Africa, the United States, and beyond to engage with some of the positive transformations occurring in Africa to help consolidate the positive gains and look at not just the challenges, but also the opportunities. One last thing, in case you missed it, there was a recent fabulous Forbes magazine profile of Brown Capital Management's founder and CEO, Eddie Brown. Here it is. I brought my prop. If you haven't read this, you have to read this. It's called The Oracle of Apopka. Meet Eddie Brown, one of Wall Street's greatest untold stories. It is a really spectacular profile. And it also discusses some guy who's a former star linebacker at the University of Virginia, who just happens to be the president and CEO of Brown Capital Management. So that man, that small and unassuming man, where is he? Where is he? Keith. Oh, there he is. How could I miss Keith? Is Keith Lee. And he's here, and I think he's got a few words to share. So welcome to the Wilson Center. Welcome back to the Wilson Center, Keith Lee. Over to you.
I had to look around. I didn't know who she was referring to, a star athlete, certainly not me. Thank you, Congresswoman Harman. Good afternoon, everyone. As Congresswoman Harman said, I am the President and Chief Operating Officer of Brown Capital Management. First, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers and guests, as well as all of you in the audience for joining us here today. On behalf of Brown Capital Management, we appreciate your continued support of the Africa Forum events hosted by our partner, the Wilson Center Africa Program. Thank you to the Africa Program for organizing today's event. The Brown Capital Management Forum is a platform for substantive, policy-oriented dialogue on key trade, investment, and sustainable development issues in Africa. Launched in 2015, the Africa Forum has now hosted 15 public events on a wide range of critical topics, from sovereign wealth funds to supply chain challenges to comparing U.S. and Chinese business models in Africa. In all cases, the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum events are opportunities to expand the discussion of critical economic and development issues in Africa and bring both challenges and opportunities to the forefront of political conversation. As Congresswoman Harman said, today's forum comes on the heels of our recent meeting in Gaborone, Botswana, joined there in partnership with the Wilson Center and the Bank of Botswana, and graciously hosted by the Bank of Botswana. The forum was entitled Sovereign Wealth Funds in Africa, Policies and Best Practices for Securing the Future. There, we also discussed the challenges and opportunities facing African sovereign wealth funds with some of the best practitioners and thinkers on that subject. At the conclusion of the two-day meeting in Botswana, we felt extremely optimistic about the work being done to ensure a more prosperous Africa. And it is in exactly that spirit that we have convened this panel today. The theme of today's discussion is critically important because, as all of you know, too often in the United States, the narrative that we hear about Africa is one of poverty, war, and ineffective or failed states. It is a crisis, a place best engaged through aid packages and humanitarian assistance. This has never been the entire story, and today more than ever, Africa is undergoing enormous transformations that challenge this narrative. Let me repeat that. This has never been the entire story, and today more than ever, Africa is undergoing enormous transformations that challenge this narrative. While there are certainly many challenges that remain, as well as brand new ones emerging, there are also enormous opportunities for economic growth, development and investment, more effective and representative governance, and improved security. If African stakeholders and their international partners are able to engage with these transformations to make the most of new opportunities while overcoming challenges, both old and new, then there is great cause for optimism. For that reason, the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum has convened this expert panel to help us understand and assess the ongoing transformation of the African continent. We want to look past the tired and antiquated narrative about Africa in order to identify the new opportunities and challenges the continent faces in the 21st century. Critically, we ask our guest speakers to offer recommendations for how policymakers, and when I say policymakers, Africans, Americans, and international, how they can best address these changes, overcome the challenges, while securing the opportunities. Again, thank you to the Africa Program, the Wilson Center, our distinguished speakers, and you, the audience, for your support of the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum, and for joining today's event. I will now turn it over to Dr. Monday Muyangwa, who we affectionately call Dr. M squared.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to take this opportunity to join Congresswoman Harman and Mr. Lee for welcoming you all to this Brown Capital Management Africa Forum event. And thank you very much, Keith, for those very kind words, and right back at you for the great partnership that we have had over the last 5 years. And thank you very much to Congresswoman Harman for the confidence that she has placed in me and the Africa program to be at the pointy end of the spear, if you will, for our programming on Africa and on U.S.-Africa relations. So thank you very much. For those of you joining us online and following us via webcast and on Twitter, I welcome you as well. You can follow the live tweets of today's event by following the Africa Program's Twitter account at Africa Up Close, all one word, and you can contribute to the discussion using the hashtag Africa's Transformation, all one word. Before we get started, I want to take the opportunity to give a big shout out to Viola Llewellyn, the co-founder and president of Ovamba Solutions, for giving us the inspiration for our event today. At our last Brown Capital Management Africa Forum event on the role of the business sector in peace building, Viola argued against outdated narratives and perceptions about Africa. And in closing, she told the audience to speak with her some more to get her thoughts and promised that she, and I quote, "I'll explain to you why this ain't your granddaddy's Africa." That one remark stuck with us and resonated with so many of our participants who attended that event. So thank you, Viola, for giving us the inspiration for this event. And I'm sorry that your travels prevent you from joining us today. But under your tagline, we have brought together this fantastic group of speakers to help us break down the major transformations that Keith and Congresswoman Harman so eloquently and clearly laid out before us. I think both of our speakers have already framed the issue. So I'm not going to go into that because I've done a wonderful job of setting the stage. All that remains for me this afternoon is to introduce our speakers. And in the interest of time, I'm going to give just a short introduction of each of them. You can find their full bios in the program materials that we have shared. Our first speaker will be Ms. Zintle Koza, who's Director for International Organizations at the National Treasury of South Africa, in which role she is responsible for South Africa's relations with the World Economic Forum and with the OECD. She is also the 2018-2019 Hubert Humphrey Fulbright Fellow, and she has just completed, as of this Friday, she will have completed as of this Friday, her term as a Public Policy Fellow here at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Jendai Fraser is the president and CEO of 50 Ventures, a private consulting and investment company focused on Africa, and she's also the adjunct senior fellow for African Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She previously served as the former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for African Affairs at the National Security Council during the Bush administration, and she was the first woman U.S. Ambassador to South Africa. Our third speaker will be Dr. Samuel Munzele Maimbo, who is a Senior Advisor in the Office of the Managing Director and the Chief Financial Officer at the World Bank. His work there focuses on finance for development, strategic oversight of finance partners, and fostering the development of new and innovative financial products, often engaging with many developing countries. Our fourth speaker will be Dr. Joseph Siegel, who's the Director for Research at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. In this capacity, he tracks Africa-wide governance and security trends and has overseen dozens of research projects on contemporary security challenges. His research focuses on the political economy of security and development, the challenges of democratic transitions, and the strengthening of democratic accountability. Our next to final speaker would be Professor Travis Adkins, a lecturer of African and Security Studies at Georgetown University. He has over 20 years of experience working in conflict and post-conflict settings throughout Africa and the Middle East. He is also the host of the podcast On Africa, which features conversations on Africa, politics, history, and culture. Our final, and certainly not the least of our speakers today, will be Ms. Unami Jeremiah, who is an advocate for women's empowerment and gender equality. She founded the Musadi Global Trust to promote female participation in political leadership and economic decision-making, and serves on the board of the Africa Youth and Adolescents Networks on Population and Development for East and Southern Africa, among her many commitments. So our format for this afternoon is that I've asked Zintle to kick things off by very quickly highlighting 4 major transformations that she sees sitting in Africa that are impacting or taking place on the African continent today. And once she has spoken, I have asked 3 questions of each of our remaining panelists. So with that, let me ask Zintle to kick things off by offering us your 4 major transformations taking place on the African continent. Zintle, wherever you feel comfortable.
Okay, thank you very much, Monday. Congressman Hammond, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you today. And I must thank the Center and Africa Program for just the tone of this discussion. It's very refreshing, and I think that it's going to be a fantastic discussion. I only have 4 minutes.
You have 4 minutes.
You are telling an African she has 4 minutes.
I am
Okay.
indeed.
All right. I work and I live in South Africa in Pretoria. So sitting there, the 4 major transformations from my point of view. The first one is around financial inclusion, specifically the development of fintech in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa has emerged as one of the fastest growing fintech regions across the globe. And by fintech, I mean, companies that are providing both financial services as well as those that enable the provision of those services. And that revolution is currently being fueled in 3 hubs, being in South Africa, in Kenya, and Nigeria. Over the past 2 years, there's been investments of over $100 million into those hubs, as well as into new destinations such as Ghana, Uganda, Cameroon, and Rwanda. And within fintech, obviously the issue of mobile money is where Sub-Saharan Africa in particular is becoming a global leader. And M-Pesa in Kenya, I think, is the most internationally, globally well-known example of this. 2 issues around the fintech. The first is that the innovations that are happening around there are allowing Africans to move up the financial services value chain, which is fantastic. Secondly, if harnessed and leveraged strategically, fintech clearly could be the critical stepping stone towards a digital economy in Africa. Obviously, issues of infrastructure, electricity, internet services, as well as policy formulation will have to impact that. So that's the first transformation. The second one is intra-Africa migration. I know this is especially if you're outside of Africa, the images are always of Africans on the boats on the Mediterranean, giving the impression that more Africans are leaving the continent. UNCTAD's 2018 Africa Economic Development Report focused on migration for structural transformation. And that report confirms that the majority of migration actually is within the African continent. More Africans are migrating within the continent instead of out of the continent. And the main receiving countries, South Africa, 2.2 million, Cote d'Ivoire, 2.1 million, with Uganda, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Kenya, each receiving an excess of 1 million African migrants in 2017. This is creating opportunities in a lot of ways. For example, we now have migration hubs in Abidjan, in Johannesburg, in Nairobi. For policymakers, this then begs the question, how do you facilitate the growth of the African citizen? Because that's where we are coming to now. You are born, for example, if you're born in Somalia, you grow up in Kenya, you go and you live and work in Johannesburg. How then do policymakers adapt to that and also enable the space for that type of talent to be utilized? Of course, there are risks and opportunities for both receiving and sending countries. The third transformation I'll talk to is urbanization. The 2018 UN revision of the World Urbanization Prospects reports has already given the stats, that by 2030, more than 50% of the African population will be living in cities. That will rise up to 68%. Although Africa remains mostly rural currently, 43%, of the population is living in only in urban areas. Sub-Saharan Africa is urbanizing at one of the fastest rates in the world. Cities like Lagos, Kinshasa, Cairo, Luanda, Ouagadougou, Nairobi, Bamako, Johannesburg are all expected to grow exponentially in the next decade. Nigeria alone is projected to add 189 million urban dwellers between 2018 and 2050. McKinsey last year estimated that by 2025, there will be 100 African cities with more than 1 million inhabitants. Opportunities that this represents. Obviously, it also presents challenges, issues of policy, urban planning, infrastructure. Also, in the long term, it will influence voting patterns as well, democratic issues, urbanization. The last area of transformation I'll look into is what I want to call people's power, discontent, and accountability. I think since the late 2000s, there's been rising popular protests on the continent. I mean, from the Arab Spring to April this year in Algeria, Sudan currently, we had Burkina Faso not long ago, the Gambia. Basically, what you're seeing is Africans who are fundamentally protesting to transform the political and economic inequities. And within that is various specific issues. It can be issues of corruption, issues of gentrification, issues of higher tertiary education, such as the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa. But all of that, to me, it points to two things, at least two key things. The first is that it's a return to the grassroots resilience and mobilization that defined so much of the anti-colonial struggle. I think for quite a while, as African people, we gave the space away for our voices to governments. But since the 2000s, it's fantastic to see that we are reclaiming that space and demanding that our discontent be taken care of. And the last issue that I think this points to is it challenges continental and regional structures such as the African Union and the regional economic communities in issues of legitimacy and accountability. If, as the AU, then you say, according to the governance charter, that the AU does not recognize unconstitutional changes of government, but then how does that translate against governments that are abusing and oppressing their people? my time is up. Thank you very much, Monday.
All right, Zintle. Fantastic. Thank you so much for getting us off to that good start. Let me now turn to Ambassador Fraser. You've had a long and distinguished career related to Africa, and you spend a considerable amount of time on the African continent as well. So I'm going to ask you to provide a broad and overarching perspective on how you see Africa transforming. What are some of the major mega trends that you are seeing, in addition to, or perhaps as a counterpoint to what Zintle has talked about already?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and for all of you being here. And it wouldn't be a counterpoint. I think it actually adds to. I agree with everything that she said so far. I think that probably for myself, the biggest major mega trends is, of course, the demographic shift, especially the rise of the youth. You know, the approximately 41% of the continent being below the age of 15 years old, and 19% between 15 and 24. I think that demographic shift is going to be a major factor in the development of the continent and this world. And I don't see it as many people see it as a ticking bomb. I think that actually the youth in Africa are agents of change, as we just said, about their pushing for greater accountability of all governing bodies. They're pushing for greater economic inclusion. And I see that energy as being a major driver of change. And so I'm quite positive about the role that the youth will play, including bringing down what I call very brittle regimes. That doesn't necessarily mean that it transforms into immediate positivity, as we see taking place in Sudan right now, but you need that energy to shake up the continent and move it forward. And so I think that the youth movement, the youth impact on the continent will be is a mega trend. The second one I would say, and I consider that positive, the second one I'd say is much more neutral. And that's when we think about the rapid technological change which is taking place in this world today, whether we're talking about artificial intelligence or cloud computing or blockchain, big data, ICT, 3D printing, all of these quantum technologies, exponential technologies, which can be described in terms, it has been described as a fourth industrial revolution. And I say that it's neutral because obviously it can be good in terms of accelerating access to water, food, energy, healthcare, education. But it also can be quite bad in terms of government surveillance, issues of privacy, issues of the social media and how information can be manipulated, the whole issue of false news. We've seen this in many elections, even in Africa. In Kenya, I was there during the elections, and you could see the role that social media was playing in creating deeper sectarian divisions. And so I definitely think how technology will shape the lives of people on the continent and how hopefully young entrepreneurs will be able to be creators in this technological revolution, not simply consumers, and actually be able to apply that technology to leapfrog some of the challenges of the continent today. And so I see that as a major mega dynamic or trend. And then the third one, I have to say I feel both that it's I put it in a negative category, but in fact it's not. And nothing is always negative. In every crisis, there's opportunity. And this is really the sort of global geostrategic reshaping of the landscape, the global landscape. And here what we're really talking about is the apparent, and I do say apparent, decline of liberal democracies, the U.S. and the EU. And I'm not just talking about in terms of their engagement in Africa, I'm talking about their role globally in shaping the institutions that set the rules for international engagement, like the Bretton Woods institutions, et cetera. where you have even the principles of free trade being questioned by what one would expect to be the defender of free trade, that being the United States, and the sort of retrenchment and the domestic turmoil that we find in many Western democracies today, whether it's the rise of these hate groups, et cetera, the social contract not being, and the legitimacy of that being under threat and under question. And then at the same time, you have the rise of China and Russia playing a role in Africa, probably China more than any other country in the world, increasing its presence, its trade relations, its geostrategic influence on the continent, but not just on the continent, globally. You see, the head of China being the defender of free trade at the World Economic Forum recently. The world is turned on its head in many ways. And I would also say increasing Russian engagement in Africa, as well as the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and UAE playing a major role right now in Sudan, putting bases on the continent, increasing their footprint not only on the Horn, where they have a geostrategic location and therefore some influence, but also across the continent, playing a role in Mali and other places. And so I think that and I'll finish there in terms of mega trends. And I'll add one last one, but then we'll come back to it. But I think I say that there's opportunity, but the problem that I see, the reason why I put it in my negative category, because I feel largely that African countries are once again witnesses to big global geopolitical changes, and not necessarily agents in the movement of the world today. Certainly agency on the continent of Africa, but not major players. And so that's where my concern and my negativity comes. With a counter to that, I'll counter myself to say that to the degree that you have the reform agenda that President Kagame led of the AU and the Continental Free Trade Agreement and the movements towards greater freedom of movement of people with a common AU passport, is the way in which African countries and population can begin to exercise that agency in terms of broader global trends.
All right. Thank you so much. Already two very rich presentations on the analysis of the trends in Africa. So let's go to a third. Samuel, what are some of the key transformations that you're seeing in Africa's economic and development space?
Thank you very much. And allow me to start by saying that I'm thoroughly intimidated sitting next to Ambassador Fraser. I've been a fan for many years, and I'd like to thank you for your service to the continent. 3 minutes, 3 things that excite me, 3 concerns, and 3 opportunities for optimism. Number 1, look, it's quite easy to be pessimistic about Africa, but I'm very cautiously optimistic. Optimistic because of long-term trends that I could spend an afternoon talking to. Let me pick 3. The first one is commercial institutions. This year, 2019, we have 4 African countries in the top 10 doing business reforms: Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, Rwanda, and Kenya. And these reforms have made it easier for domestic African entrepreneurs to conduct business. Number 2 is health, the unsung hero of reform. Over the last 10 years or so, we've cut the number of deaths from malaria by 50%. Today, there are about 8 countries that have managed to reduce maternal mortality by over 60%. The third one that excites me as well is the democratization of finance, both at the national, private firm, and household level. Households, increasingly, you will find by mobile technology that Zindler referred to, you've got access to banks that you didn't have access to before. By virtue of the growth of private equity on the continent, there is greater access to finance for firms than we've seen before. Even at national level, my friends would kill me for saying so, but I'm delighted that there are more countries that are not wholly dependent on the Bretton Woods institutions for finance. Of course, some have got into trouble in the process, and I'll come back to that. All of these trends never make it to the mainstream media, but the effect is felt. And you only have to look at some of the macro data to see these results. So globally, people will say, well, Africa is growing rather slowly. GDP growth is in the region of 2.7%. Two key facts to remember there. One is that it's actually growing. It was 2.6 before, and it's projected to continue growing. Slowly, but it is growing. The one data, if you unpack that data and you take out the big economies of South Africa, Nigeria, and Angola, you find that growth on the continent is actually at 4.7, which is remarkable when global growth is at 2.3. So if you take the time to start unbundling some of these statistics that people are too quick to throw, there's actually a fantastic growth story in many more countries than we give credit to. If you take FDI, another statistics that is usually thrown around to demonstrate that Africa is not making progress, 1.7% of the global share of FDI is low. I admit that. But at the same time, if again you take out those big heavyweights and you look at what's happening on the rest of the continent, the numbers are impressive. If you just take private equity, in 2017, between 2013 and 17, you have about 134 IPOs on the African continent. African firms listing on African markets, on international stock exchanges, raising in excess of $20 billion. Still rather small globally, but that's a 34% increase on the previous decade, right? I could go through a number of data points where if you take the time to unpack the data, there's actually a lot of positive news that excites me. And there's good reason why I picked institutions, health, and finance, and I'll come back to it in terms of, I think, what we need to do. But before I do that, to earn my pay, I do need to highlight the risks. That's my day job. There are three that worry me. One is debt, right? So we have been pressing on the accelerator in terms of public debt. The levels are worrying. 24% of the 54 African countries are distressed, 14 highly distressed, and they would be excessive breadlines if were it not for the cushion that the private sector is actually providing these sovereign governments in dealing with the levels of debt that we're seeing. Corporate debt is another that we don't talk about. That one is a big problem because there are too many firms that are dependent on government contracts. So if government is in debt, they're not getting paid. So the risk of a financial crisis for some of our countries is high. But those are the immediate risks I worry about. The two longer-term risks are fragility and climate. Fragility, Ambassador Fraser rightly pointed out that there are some countries that are still on the brink in terms of democratic agents that will make sure that growth is sustainable. We, on the African continent, have about 7 million refugees. We've got 25 million who are at the brink of becoming refugees. We do need to monitor that carefully. Climate worries me as well. When you just think about the last cyclone, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi, too many people are vulnerable, and even in the midst of success. With the 1 minute, let me focus on where I see growth. So the part that I think we do need to focus on, and both my previous speakers have alluded to it, is the youth population. I agree with you. That's a fantastic opportunity. When you have 41% of the population under the age of 15, means that by the 2050, Africa will have the largest working population globally between age 15 and 64. That's a significant potential. The second area, I haven't given up on globalization, but I would put a twist to that. I think increasingly more African countries are discovering that it's much easier to trade with their neighbors. And so I'm particularly excited about the regional trade agreements that have been signed. And if there's one policy area that we should be investing a lot more in, it is that space. And the very last point is on the digital aspect of it. I think Africa has proved itself on the retail side, the mobile phones, the banking services. What it really needs to invest in is the hardcore infrastructure for enterprises to do the same in creating jobs, in making sure that we actually have sustainable, meaningful digital economies to make sure that this growth that we're experiencing is sustained over the long haul. Thank you.
All right, so we're continuing the tradition of some really, really good points and analysis. Dr. Siegel, let me turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the governance dimension of this. What are the transformations that you are seeing on the governance front?
Okay, thank you very much. And being the fourth speaker, I'm going to start to be a little bit redundant with things that are said, but I'm going to put a governance twist on them and bring out some of those dimensions. So I would start with this issue of improved access to information. So this digitized transformation that's taking place has really caused Africa to move from being an information desert 15 years ago or so to being a very highly information-rich civilization or continent in terms of access to information. So today I think the latest data, and it's hard to keep up with the data because it's changing so rapidly, but the estimates are 75% of all adults have access to a cell phone today. There's about 140 million African Facebook users every month. And so Africa is the fastest changing continent in terms of gaining access to information. Community radio. Africans still, despite the digitization of information, most people still get information through radio. But access to independent sources of information across radio have really been transformed over the last 10 to 15 years as well. So people are getting more information, better information than they ever have. And this is changing the way they engage with governments, the way they think about issues, the way they're informed. And so I think this is very hopeful and will continue to be transformative. This touches on my second point, which Zintle also mentioned about protest. And really since the late 2000s, we've seen a spike in protest across the continent. And most people treat this as a negative thing, as a sign of dissent. But I see it as a positive because it's an expression of democratic participation, that people are engaging their governments. They want to change. And so this is, we've seen protests for a whole host of reasons, often for democratic reforms. It's also about public service delivery or protesting the current living conditions. But this wasn't the norm a decade or so back. And so it's a real reckoning that governments now have to face in terms of their populations. From a governance standpoint, this is what we talk about vertical accountability, that there's some responsiveness now to the general public that didn't exist in the past. The third thing I would mention, and we talked about migration, but I would throw in the importance of forced displacement. And this is a negative concern. We're currently at record levels of forced displacement on the continent. There's 25 million people who are either internally displaced refugees or seeking political asylum. And 90% of these people are originating in places facing conflict. There's 12 countries in conflict, all of them internal conflict. And this is causing a lot of instability in terms of population movements. From a governance standpoint, I would add to that 8 of the 10 top generators of these displaced people are autocratically governed. And so there's a very clear link between the instability we see and poor governance. So just two of we're considering minor transformations. One is on changing institutions. And this is a hard one to talk about because they change slowly over time. We don't necessarily notice. But I think in some ways it's the most important. Since what was called the third democratic wave, the opening in the 1990s towards multi-party systems in Africa, we've seen a gradual strengthening of institutions in Africa across a host of sectors that are important for accountability and better governance. Electoral commissions, courts, parliaments, central banks, civil services that are more merit-based. And I would add Africa security sectors. They're more capable. There's a higher level of training, education, there's more strengthening that's happening now. This is not always consistent. It's not uniform across the continent. Sometimes there's recessions in this growth, but it's an important change that needs to be recognized and to realize that this isn't our granddaddy's Africa.
Thank you.
And the last point, and it's a counterpoint to the first one I mentioned in terms of access to information, is with the growth of access to information and the engagement in that information by African societies, there's been a pushback. And so over the last 3 years, we've seen 16 African governments shut down the internet in a time of crisis. And basically, they're trying to claw back control of information. And often they're largely successful. And so it raises issues that we'll come back to later about, what do you do? What are the implications of that? And again, I would say of the 16, 12 of them are autocratically governed. And so, we need to keep in mind why do these governments not want that information out there? And why don't they want their populations to engage with it?
Thank you so much. All right, Travis, over to you to talk to us about the security dimension of this. So, and you have the distinction of continuing this really good trajectory of analysis. So let's go.
Yes, thank you. The first thing I'd want to say is just to thank you, Monde, and to thank the Wilson Center staff. I think this is exactly the kind of bright and diverse type of panels that I would love to see a lot more of in Washington. So thank you guys for organizing that. The second thing I would say, to pick up where Joe left off, on this notion of redundancy, right? So I would frame it maybe a little bit differently, right? Not so much that it is redundant, but actually the way that the panel is playing out proves to you the deep interconnections between all of these sectors, the fact that these are issues that cannot be compartmentalized. And I think that points to us continually challenging ourselves in the State Department, in USAID, in the Department of Defense, in the Millennium Challenge Corporation about how we view the world. And have we divided ourselves in ways that don't allow us to communicate across these sectors and address problems in a much more holistic manner. So from there, I would basically just start off by saying in terms of security in Africa, what we've seen in the post-Cold War era is actually a drastic reduction of certain types of violence on the continent, and that's particularly interstate types of conflict. But what we have seen is a shift in the nature of security threats on the continent. So large increases in terrorism types of attacks, urban riots, insurgencies in state peripheries, election-related violence, civic protest, which often turned violent largely due to overreactions from repressive governments. I think another way that Africa is transforming in terms of the security sector is this kind of reemergence, which Jendai mentioned, as of Africa as kind of being seen in great game competition, right? Not being seen on its own terms, but being seen as a place for the world to act on rather than being seen as an actor in the world with its own objectives, priorities, and foreign policy aims. In terms of mega transformations, again, I would echo the democracy and development deficits, right? So when you look at it and you say, we always hear, Africa has the 6 or 7 fastest growing economies in the world. But under that is the question of how is that wealth being distributed, is the question of the intense inequality that is coming along with that growth. Second is the incomplete democratization across the continent. And so many repressive leaders, tyrants, and dictators have mastered the game that we like to play. Did you have an election? Was it free and fair? Now we've moved from free and fair to safe, secure, right? Moving away from certain type of metrics which are very difficult for us to manage. And then I would also say in the democratization space that we've done a really strong job, I think, in working with civil society organizations and increasing people's adherence to democratic ideals in terms of the citizenry, their demand, right, for these kinds of things. So on the demand side, there's no issue, I don't think. But I think the real challenge is on the supply side. Are these people who are making these intense demands in countries where the governments are willing or able to meet those demands at an increasing pace? Demographic factors have also been mentioned, and I do agree that these can have a positive impact. So I don't think that the negativity would come from the youth, but I do think that there's a serious challenge as to whether governments will be prepared to take on this surge of folks coming into the workforce, or at least of working age. What skills will they be prepared with? Will they have opportunities? And if they don't, what is going to become of them and all of the energy that they bring to a society? Next, I would just talk about quickly the enduring strife in Africa's major regional conflict complexes, right? And so that basically refers to West Africa, Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, Niger. In Central Africa, obviously, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and in the Horn of Africa, obviously. And these complexes, while we don't have outright, interstate conflicts, what we do have is regional conflicts, which can induce proxy types of warfare and conflict, which can produce spillover in terms of refugee populations, and the ways in which that creates stress on the infrastructure of societies and political pressure on the political infrastructure of societies. To Zintley's point, that 80% of refugees in Africa are actually hosted in African countries, giving the lie to the notion of a European refugee crisis, but also creating a problem for neighboring African countries who may already be at wit's end actually to serve their own populations.
Thank you, Travis. Unami, bring us home. So you have your wonderful foundation, Musali Foundation, done lots of work with youth as well. So how do you see gender and youth fitting into some of these transformative dynamics that are ongoing on the continent?
Thank you so much, Dr. Monde. I would say that quite often, a lot of times, the youth is always seen as that constituency that is going to bring about the change, that is going to benefit from the change. But when it comes to the actual, engagement of young people in political spaces and economic decision-making spaces, we do not find young people, we do not find women in those spaces. And so for me, what is exciting in terms of this transformation is the rise of women's political leadership. We are seeing quite a few African states that have gone through recent elections come up to provide a more gender balanced cabinet, like the case of South Africa. Just recently, we've seen women being appointed in key positions, as of the case of Ethiopia, as well as Rwanda. So Africa as a continent has always been the one that set the tone onto how women's participation and leadership looks like. We just do not document those stories, but we have had quite a few of those women who have come up to positions that even countries in the so-called first world are yet to achieve. And so for me, that is something that excites me. The thing that I worry about is that, our electoral processes are still disadvantaging women to run for political office. And so if there could be a change in how we structure our elections and, who gets to run for political office, that would be a welcome development. But also when we look at party level, in the party structures, we see women doing the fundraising, the campaigning, to campaign to put men in office. And I'm like, what if you go door to door and speak about yourself instead of the other person and see if you could actually get that spot? And so we also know that elections are very expensive. So a lot of women do not have the financial resources to be contesting for elections. Of course, there will be those outliers that one, two young woman who has managed to get into political office without any financial assistance, but that is just that one tool. We shouldn't concentrate on the outliers, but concentrate on where are the other women and young people. And the second thing that I worry about is that we often talk about youth unemployment, but we do not talk about youth underemployment, because we find that in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly, a lot of young people cannot afford not to work. So whatever job that you will get and work at it, even if it's paying you next to nothing, even if it's not safe, it doesn't have any benefit, you would take that job because you cannot afford not to work. So when we look into this data and say, well, youth unemployment in sub-Saharan Africa is dropping, we should be more focused on the type of jobs that these African youth are getting or involved in. Whereas when we look in North Africa, we see that it's a reverse of sub-Saharan Africa in terms of that there is high rise of youth unemployment, especially amongst young people who have been educated. So they are much more overskilled than what the economies can handle. And so, if you don't get a job, then it becomes something else. You wonder, why did I go to school? Why did I spend all that time trying to get this education if I'm not going to get a job? And so we find that, 1 in 7 of these young people are looking for jobs, myself included. And so here we are. And so another thing is that we find that now when we integrate the data, we'd find that young women are more affected by both the youth unemployment and the youth underemployment. And right now, when we focus on North Africa in particular, we see that the labor force participation is extremely low for women. It is the second globally after the Middle East. And so that also shows that there is issues that need to be addressed there. And then the third thing that I hear about, concerning the digital economy and the age of automation and artificial intelligence, these are great transformation, but I worry, one, about the security and the safety of people as they engage in the internet and the information that they share and bring about. I worry about young women's safety on the internet, the people they meet. We always hear of these issues of, the catfishing, the this, the that, but there are no measures in place to protect especially young women from being trafficked for sex or human trafficking through the means of the internet. And also there are issues where now, we live in an age where we just react to information. Something happens and all of a sudden we're all tweeting, retweeting without even knowing the background information about what had happened. And so recently, if everybody's keeping up with the news, you'd find out that my country, I'm from Botswana, and so there was the hunting ban on elephants was lifted, and it caused a whole spectacle where celebrities and other influential people, across the borders were, complaining, not really understanding the level at which the human and animal conflict has really intensified in our country. How the women that are having farms which are near the Chobe area are struggling because when the elephants leave the national park, they roam into those farms. They destroy the crops that these women are growing. They have killed people. There are families that are grieving because they have lost loved ones to these conflicts. And so we cannot just be in an age where we're just reacting just because somebody wrote breaking news, You need to take time, take a step back, breathe, take a glass of water, find out what really is going on. And so those, for me, are some of the dynamics that we need to navigate even as these transformations are being coming out. And so thank you so much for your time.
Okay. All right, so really fantastic discussion here and the issues that our panel has pinpointed. I see a lot of you, and I really want to get it to the audience so we can engage in the Q&A. But before I do, I'd ask each of you for 3 recommendations on how we better engage. I'm not going to go for 3. I'll be happy to take those in writing. I want each of you to identify in a minute just the one recommendation that you have about how we can better engage with one of the issues that you raised. So you have a minute. Pick one. I will take your notes. We will type up your other recommendations and distribute them. So, Nami, we're starting with you now. So you bring it in. What's your one recommendation about how we can best engage with this transformation on one issue?
For me, it'll have to be the human capital development. I think we really need to be intentional about capacitating and developing our people, particularly in Africa. Things like implementing a STEM-focused curriculum within the education spectrum, so that we have young people who are interested in not only being participants of tech, but exploring ideas, making products, and participating in that kind of capacity. But also in terms of human capital development, looking at enforcing a gender-responsive education that will enable conservations between girls and boys to know that this is we are both partners in this in the world and in the things that we do, that no one is inferior and superior than the other, but also it's about being intentional about improving the infrastructure, because oftentimes we feel like, oh, we need to change our indices, but there isn't any commitment in terms of improving infrastructure, improving not only roads. When we think infrastructure, we think roads, but I'm thinking in the lines of the database, the healthcare systems, the school governance systems that are going to track young people as they go into the school system and as they leave. It is easier for us to be able to track even the young women that are dropping out of school due to adolescent pregnancy. If we have systems that are tracking them, it's easier for us to have programs that will help them re-enter the school system once they have dropped off. So I think for me, it's definitely human capital development.
All right, fantastic. Travis, what's your recommendation?
I would say it's a focus on our approach to Africa. And so right now, I would critique us for essentially viewing Africa as kind of, a toy that we weren't playing with, and then we didn't get interested until someone else picked it up. So I would want us to move away from that, to see the continent on its own terms, not as some global backwater. I would chide us and say that you can't be a global leader if you're going to ignore broad swaths of the globe. I would say that our commitment has to move away from firefighting and the kind of 2 and 3 and 5 year project-based kind of cycles that we look at, and really get deep down into issues of governance and economic growth and institution building. And again, this notion that Africa should be a partner for collaboration, not a tool for us simply to advance our own foreign policy objectives.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Joe.
Okay. I would say we should make democracy and good governance the rubric for our engagement on the continent. That democracies make better partners, and mutual benefits happen over time. They're not transactional. And there's a long track record of democracies doing better economically in terms of providing social benefits for their citizens. They're a better source for foreign direct investment, adhering to the rule of law. And I think this also gets to the point of, when there's international engagement promoting democracy, it's also a pushback against those international actors that are trying to move in and uphold autocratic governance. So we don't recognize that there's a governance element to some of these other international actors that are trying to make inroads on the continent. And I would particularly specifically go to the issue of term limits. That there had been some good progress on term limits in Africa, through like 2015 or so. But then we've seen some recession in the last few years. And this just correlates with so many other factors. Countries that have term limits are less likely to have conflicts. There's less corruption in areas of term limits. And just one fact that's interesting, countries with term limits, the average time in office for those current leaders is 4 years. For those countries in Africa without term limits, the average time in office for those leaders is 22 years. So it's there's a big impact from that. So.
Thank you. Samuel, what's your one recommendation?
I do threes.
No.
I will be
Pick
super
one.
quick. Invest in data. Let Africa tell its own story. Most countries have about 80% in the informal sector. The official statistics, including our own, don't tell the full story. Number two, Mr. Lee, take private sector investors to Africa. They have to smell Africa, drink the water there to understand that they are investment opportunities. And the very last one, invest in human capital. I went through an education system that left me knowing every single U.S. state, including capital, including
Yes.
production, and I had no clue what the northern province of our country was producing. If you can fix that, I'll be very happy. Thank you.
It must have been something with the Zambian educational system, because I could name every
Yes, it was.
state capital in the United States.
In alphabetical order and
Thank
backwards,
you.
too.
Okay. All right. We got that one figured out. Ambassador Fraser, what's your
I'm
recommendation?
going to follow Samuel's lead and do three very quickly.
Okay.
One is I think we need to change our tone. This is now the United States government, and our attitude, our mindset in terms of Africa. And I pick up what Travis says. I don't have to repeat it. I think he has said it already. Two, I think African countries need to be concerned, and people, of who are they benchmarking against. Yes. What I mean by that is you got to play at the global level, and look at, the continent is transforming certainly, but how fast versus how fast other things are changing, because the speed matters. For moving, making big transformative changes. And then the final one, I'd like to quote Melody Hobson. She's the president of Aerial Investments, and she had a quote that says, "Don't spit in the ocean. Whatever you do, do it at scale because you can." And so that, again, goes to mindset and also the opportunity that's there, both for African countries and people, but also for the United States and others.
Thank you. Cynthia, you have the final word on the recommendation. What's yours?
From an African point of view, I think mine for me is policy coherence. Since the Lagos 1980 Plan of Action, people who are cynical always say there's always been these plans, Africa regional integration. Implementation and policy coherence, especially in areas where we can get competitive advantage. That's something that as African, I think, economies we have not really used. The issue of, for example, going back to fintech, we know now we have 3 main hubs on the continent, and we know that there are other countries, west and north, who are developing. Why can't we talk to each other in terms of policy development? We know that we're going to have to talk around taxation of the digital economy. Are we preparing for that? So for me, really, the issue that I know there's a lot of work that's gone into, regional integration. We are entering the operationalization stage of the continental free trade. So all of these issues will come up. We really need to move beyond the rhetoric and get to the actual coherence and the implementation. And then the last one as well is, you see, it's in my mind. Yes, the very last one as well. And I think the last is also from an African perspective is, with all the projections of 2050, all of this is coming. I think that we're gonna get to a space where the populations are not going to wait any longer. I think for me, being on the continent, this is my sense. Being in South Africa as well, this is my sense, that there's only been so much that ordinary Africans are willing to put up with. And this is the time that as governments, we really need to stop the rhetoric and implement and push. Thank you.
All right. Fantastic. So let me now open it up to the audience, all of you. And so those of you who've been here know what the rules of engagement are, but they're worth going over. So we're going to take 3 questions at a time, or 3 comments at a time. You're not allowed to speak for more than 1 minute, right? So if you would like to be acknowledged to speak, just raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you. Somebody will bring a mic to you. And once they do, identify yourself or the institution to which the institution with which you're affiliated, identify the speaker to whom you're addressing the question, and then keep it to a minute. I have the automatic switch down here. So I will take the gentleman down here, take this gentleman here, and then come to Mel.
So, Hendrik Mason, this the whole panel. I don't have anybody to ask this question to, so the whole panel. The question I'm asking is land issues in Africa. I think nobody talked about land issues. Land disputes is serious in Africa. We know about it in South Africa. Nobody has talked about their issues, how to deal with those issues, with the disputes. They're not judicial processes to deal with land issues. So how could companies come and invest in Africa if we have all these land disputes and they're not judicial processes to deal with these land issues? Thank you so much.
Okay. The gentleman right here.
Hi, Ryan Kennedy with CSIS. I want to pick up on a couple of strands that some of the panelists have talked about. Particularly Travis mentioned reframing the way the United States and other Western nations think about interacting with the continent, changing it away from acting on to partnering and collaboration. And also Ambassador Fraser mentioned the rise of China and getting more involved in Africa. And I was just wondering how, from a U.S. perspective, we should be thinking about engaging with African countries, doing positive investments, positive collaborations, while at the same time, managing the, surveillance aspects, the technological aspects, and the authoritarian shifts that a lot of these projects involving China may contribute to.
Okay. Mel, gentleman in front here.
Yeah, Mel Foote, Constituency for Africa. Thank you for the panel. Wonderful. I have a lot of questions, but I'm putting them in 1 minute.
No,
Mondi.
you have one question in 1 minute.
Easy. We talk about healthcare is improving, but I'm looking at Ebola, I'm looking at AIDS and other infectious diseases, and I'm seeing my government, the U.S. government, is pulling back from Africa, and some of the rhetoric around climate change is going the wrong way. I think climate change is going to be a bigger issue in Africa going forward. I think also African governments are being asked to foot the bill in Mali and the Sahel region for security, when in fact this is a manifestation of the war on terror. And so rather than pay for schools and medical clinics and so forth, they're being asked to buy weapons from the U.S., of course.
You snuck in a few in there. All right. So let me, the land question and how it fits into the transformation that's ongoing in Africa, particularly how it articulates with investment in Africa. The second issue and how the United States can do better or stronger and better engagement with Africa within the larger geostrategic dynamic that's taking place on the African continent today, particularly on the governance side and in other areas. And then a bunch of issues that Mel raised regarding U.S. engagement, approach to engagement right now, and how factors of climate change figure into the transformation that we've been talking about in terms of how resources to foot the security bill are taking away from some of the other governance issues and other development issues that they could be funding. So let me do this just very quickly. I'll give you each an opportunity to pick one of those and respond to one. I think the easier one was the two questions for Travis and Jendai on U.S. engagement. If you could speak to those in a minute, just attempt that, and then we'll open it up to the others to speak to the land question and the issue that Mel raised. Go ahead.
Well, I would just say a couple of things. One is that one of the successors to Ambassador Fraser, Assistant Secretary Linda Thomas Greenfield, says to me often, you can't change what you don't engage, right? And so I think that this is a huge part of our approach to Africa that I think African leaders often call us out for hypocrisy on, right? And so if not talking to the leader of the Gambia, or if not talking to Mugabe, or if not talking to al-Bashir is a punishment, then certainly they see that you are talking to the king of Saudi Arabia, right? That you are talking to other repressive leaders in other parts of the world. And I think that they're quite clear on what the differences are between those leaders and themselves. And so I think that that's a big part of that approach. I think also, again, this notion that you can be a global leader and neglect large swaths of the earth is a fallacy, right? And I think that many African leaders are actually waiting for U.S. engagement, U.S. foreign direct investment, and they prefer it over and above China and India and the Gulf states. But when we're absent, other nations fill those voids, and then again, we're always coming late to the party.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I can't fully answer your question, but I would say that first and foremost, the United States needs to listen and take African initiatives as the lead. And what we tend to do, and I don't understand why, honestly, is let's just take, for example, two of the biggest ones that have come up, which is the AU reforms, which is continental scale. We have opposed their efforts to get the Chapter 8 financing out of the UN Security Council for AU peacekeeping, or for African peacekeeping operations, which are primarily African forces carrying them out, yet that would contribute to our sharing the burden. It would contribute to stability on the continent. It would contribute to American business and private sector going in. So I don't understand why we would take an oppositional position to African initiatives like the AU financing for peacekeeping operations, or like just knee-jerk against the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. You know, those big, huge, symbolic, important initiatives, and we're on the wrong side of history again on them. It makes no sense, and we're going to lose the battle in the end anyway. And so why would we not have a position or a posture in which our starting point is let's try to support, those initiatives versus let's be in opposition. And then if we come to some problem where this is a particular technical issue that we can't, then we manage it, we engage, and we work around it. And so that's the first thing. Secondly, I would say that we've already lost the competition with China, and from the point of view of geostrategic influence in Africa. We have residual influence that's extremely important, and that residual influence lies in civil society across the continent. I think that African young people, African populations want freedom, right? They want transparency. They do not want to be governed by autocratic states. And so there's this residual, even though the Western history with Africa is problematic, from colonialism and slavery and blah, blah, blah. But in fact, the sort of global position that the liberal order represents is more aligned with the values of the African population than, because they've also gone through their coup d'etats, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone knows what an autocratic government looks like, and it's why it's so fragile. And so we have tremendous residual influence, but when you talk about political footprint, economic footprint, even security today, position within the Security Council, China and Russia are playing much more robust engagement right now. China's trade, two-way trade with Africa is about $204 billion. Ours is about $64 billion today. China has the biggest trading relationship with Africa. Of course, the EU with all of those countries is bigger, but as a single country, China is bigger. So I think that we need to play where we have our strength, and we need to do it. And it's not against another country. It's with African countries and with African institutions. And if we do it that way, and if we play at scale, don't spit in the ocean, but if we play at scale with the Millennium Challenge, with the, what is the Obama Initiative for Youth?
Yali.
Yeah, Yali. If you play at scale, with PEPFAR and et cetera, then in fact, you'll have a constructive engagement with Africa that's beneficial not only to the continent and America, but to the world as a whole.
All right, thank you. Does anybody want to comment on the land question and the question raised by Mel? So, Unami?
Yeah, I will just make my contribution on the land issue. Land ownership is quite a challenging topic right now throughout the continent because our communities have always been, well, most of them have been communal and tribal. So a lot of our land was owned by the community, no single person owned land, a family owned land. And so even when the patriarch of the family dies, the land is inherited by the male of that household. And so now with the changing land administration systems and so on, now we're seeing people having the ability to own land, but women are still at a disadvantage of owning land because of those patriarchal values that our continent still has held on very tightly to. And one of the things that I believe it's an opportunity is to, of course, like my colleague Zinhle was saying, we need policy coherence, especially when it comes to land. Who gets land? How many pieces of land do you get? Because now we are in an age and era in which a single individual can own square kilometers of land when the other people within that same community do not even own land. We still have issues where, the colonial aftermath in which now most of our prime locations, our prime land is not in the hands of our people. And that is a conversation that we still need to have within our countries and come to that agreement that we need to pave a way, because if our people do not own the prime location, the prime lands in which we are benefiting off, whether it's tourism or commercial agriculture, then what future lies for our people, especially young people? And for us as young people within the continent, we are going to have to buy land because we no longer can apply for land. And so that is also another issue. And so we need better policy coherence and implementation when it comes to land issues, but also we need the data and the research to document who owns land where and at what capacity. And most of the time we do not have researchers, African researchers who are documenting that. And that is something that presents as an opportunity to the US and other partners to support African research, because nobody is going to tell our stories better than we do. So until we do that, then we still have this challenge to be ongoing.
All right. Some of you wanted to add on to that. I'll take another round of question after this, and then we can bring it in.
I wanted to quickly compliment what you've just said on land. I don't dispute anything that you've said, because in many communities that indeed is true. But this is where Africa has the one-story challenge, because if we do leave that narrative, there are many who are left with a view that that is a continent-wide problem.
Yeah.
And yet, when you start looking at the data and you say which countries over the last 10 years have digitized their land records, I could name 7 right now: Malawi, Zambia, Rwanda, Tanzania, and a few others, right? If you go into these jurisdictions, it is actually possible for an investor to acquire land, dispose of land, trade in land. Sadly, once that is done right, we wipe all of that slate clean when one investor buys 750 hectares of land. Now, that sounds like a ton of land, but you go to Zambia, that's the size of France, Germany, and Belgium combined. It's not a big tract of land. So managing that narrative is really important, and that's where we've failed. And that's not to say that those challenges do not remain. But actually what I find that in countries where we've engaged in land reform, it's not the land administration itself that is the hurdle, it's the rest of the stuff, the governance and the politics and the security and the other relationship issues. So just managing that fact. And if you'll allow me 30 seconds, I'm
timing you, Samuel, I'm timing you.
I know. Just to say, again, there was a question here about health and the importance of the US government to engage. I get emotional when I talk about PEPFAR because I lost half my graduate class to HIV and AIDS when the statistics in Zambia and the infection rate were horrendous until that program came along and made it cheaper, made it easier to talk about HIV and AIDS. And there are few governments around the world who have that wherewithal to engage in public policy of that nature and encourage domestic resources to be applied to that. And so whatever can be done to make sure that we don't disengage from these sectors, especially the ones that don't get the publicity, it's critical. And if anything that you can do to keep that going, thank you. Please keep it up.
I hear you on that. I also get very emotional talking about the PEPFAR program because, like you, I think my own family, in fact, I don't know of a single family in Zambia that was not impacted by the HIV AIDS crisis. And I think there was one time that Zambian life expectancy was 39 years of age.
That's true. I'm living in overtime right now.
Exactly. Exactly. So I'm with you, I hear you, and I fully endorse that. Let me take another round of questions. What I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you 30 seconds so we can take in a bunch and bring it in for the last round here. So let me see a show of hands and see what we have. All right, let me start with the lady in the back over there. I'll come to the lady over here, and there's a gentleman over there. I'll take that 3. So in 30 seconds, ask your question, and then I'll take the remaining questions. So let's go.
Okay, my name is Rose Amolo, and I am from the Bizel Group. And my question really just follows up from the last gentleman. Can we discuss governance? Can we discuss who finances that? We are all looking at investments and all other things, but nobody wants to pay for investing in the structures and the governance, and that's what I think is missing. We're doing a lot of reforms, but there's the governance issues, whether it's health, whether it's land, whether it's whatever it is. Who's paying for it? How can we pay for it? And what can we do to improve those structures? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Beth Steiner, and I work with the Office of Sudan and South Sudanese Programming in USAID. And my question for you is, thank you, Ambassador Fraser, for talking about working with people and scaling projects to the proper scale. My question was, what do you think the role of the U.S. should be, where the will of the people might be present, but the will of the government or political will might not be on your side? So, for example, obviously Sudan and the protests and Khartoum and the violence, you have like incredible will for moving towards a democratic government, but the military working against you. So, thank you.
Thank you. And the gentleman way in the back over there.
Thank you. My name is Johannes Kassaun. I'm coming from the Institute for Economic Growth.
Could you hold your mic up closer? Thank you.
Johannes Kassaun from Economic Growth and Legal Reform Institute. Security. Should I say that some governments put security, especially the insurgents, as a kind of a marginal thing, less budget, just time to keep themselves on power because it brings in money, it brings in attention, and how does the U.S. Intervene this? Like, for example, making facilities for negotiation between insurgents and the government. One just very small question about internet. Is it not, it's very important, Samuel and Joseph, you are talking about expansion of internet, but internet is it not a kind of a freedom of speech, but controlled, and that it should be part of a development of civil society, the development of the private sector. It should be linked with that. Ambassador, if you can say,
I am going all African on you. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So we have 3 questions. The governance question that my sister asked over there, and I don't know, it's a big question. That could be the topic of a conference for a whole day, if not a whole week. But I have a brilliant panel here, so I will let them delve into it. Who is paying for it, and how can we make it, how do we invest better in governance? The question, and this has been a dilemma for the U.S. as well as other partners, of how does the U.S. work with the people where they are autocratic governments who do not want them to work with the people? So how do you bridge that, that gap? What can U.S. agencies do in that space? So another governance question. The third is also a governance question, which is really talks about the half-hearted attempts of some governments to fight insurgents, I think is what the question was about. And that, there is benefit to keeping the insurgencies going. And in that context, what do you do if you're a partner? All right. So I don't know who wants to be brave enough to take these questions. But let me start with Travis, and then I'll come to Dr. Joe. You have not spoken, and then I'll come down here.
Sure, thank you. I think it's a serious question and obviously a serious issue. I mean, when we look at kind of U.S. support for African militaries, right, there's a part of this which is about this notion of kind of African solutions for African problems, right? And the fact that if we provide certain types of training, which is not just tactical and strategic, but that should and does include issues of human rights, issues of the separation between what is a police issue and what should be a military issue, right? So you're talking about security sector reform writ large, not just transfers of armaments and things of that nature. Then at the congressional level and the legislative level, I mean, we have things like the Global Magnitsky Act, right, which deals with some of the parameters that we place around our engagement with foreign militaries. What is the criteria, right? As Joe was mentioning, right, this notion of us only engaging, he was talking about with certain governments, but in this aspect, I mean with certain militaries. So if you look at the response to Boko Haram in Nigeria, there were certain things that we were not willing to do and certain things that we were not willing to provide the Nigerian military because of their human rights record. And so there is this fine balance, which I don't think anyone has the answer for right now, about how to support people to do the things that are in our mutual interest, but how to prevent them from doing the things which are not. So you look at a country like Uganda, and people chide Museveni. He is one of these long-standing kind of lifetime presidents that Joe was mentioning, but at the same time, the Ugandan military is supporting efforts against al-Shabaab in Somalia. The Ugandan military is supporting defense and security issues in South Sudan, right? And so on one hand, they are doing many things that are mutually beneficial to U.S. national interests, while on the other hand, often at home, they're doing things with the other hand that we wouldn't agree with. And so I think it continues to be a challenge.
All right. Dr. Joe?
Okay, I'll quickly try to throw in a couple of additional points to what Travis is saying. On the question about how do we invest in good governance, as Monday said, it's a huge question. I would just throw in a couple of observations that, I had made the point that democracies tend to do better in investing in their people. And reasons for that are when you ask citizens in Africa and most places around the world, they care about health, they care about education, they care about, meeting their basic needs. When you empower that voice through democratic means, that tends to command more of your public resources. The problem that we see too often in places that lack these services is that the mechanism of allocating resources to needs is broken down. And that's because there are other patronage and political economy issues that are redirecting those resources. And so, I would say make it more transparent, get more popular participation in the decision-making processes, and we'll see some shifts. We've even seen examples where when people trust their government, the level of tax evasion goes way down. And so people are willing to pay taxes because they believe those services are going to be benefiting them. And so those are some of the things I would touch on. The point with regard to the internet and how does that lead to change, I think you're raising a really important point, and it's the next stage of where we're at. Yes, it's great that there's this access to information and people more informed. How does that lead to change? And I think part of the challenge, and it gets to my point about institutions and the place we're at right now, is that because institutions have been weak, citizens aren't able to use information to actually affect change. And so we're seeing a resurgence of big man politics where they're overriding what checks and balances are in place and sustaining their times in power. And so I think this is going to be a real flashpoint, because if people are informed and they're realizing what's going on, yet they're not able to change it, that frustration is going to boil over into other places. And I think that gets to the point on what do you do for citizens where they might want change, but the population, where the governments don't. I think we can help be a voice for those citizens because their domestic checks and balances aren't working. Their voices aren't being heard domestically. And without having to intervene or do anything dramatic, we can at least speak up. We can put pressure on those governments to let them know there are costs for their actions. And I think those are at least some basic things that can be done.
All right, Zinle, 30 seconds, and then I'll conclude with a final set of questions.
Thanks, two quick ones. For governance, who's paying? I think for the U.S., it might be useful to just get also a layout of all the other partnerships that other countries are doing with Africa. For example, the EU supports governance issues in Africa, the Nordic countries. I think it will also assist to better understand what's already being done on the ground. And then the issue of social media as well. On the positive, it's become such a tool for mobilizing and organizing in Africa. For example, Bob Wine gets arrested in Uganda, and on Twitter, he gets support from Kenya, from Nigeria, from South Africa. So it's a very, it's a positive that's going to continue. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have just 30 seconds on the governance issue, just 30.
Just give me a second. Here's what I'm going to do. And you can say that in your final 30 seconds, because I'm coming to you all for final 30 seconds. I don't want to keep everybody here till. So there were three other questions. Again, just your 30 seconds. So, okay. The four of you. The gentleman back there, the lady down here, the lady in the jacket here, and I'll conclude with you, sir. So let's go. The gentleman in the blue shirt, right there. 30 seconds.
Kudos to the seminar for time management. Question is, for the two gentlemen in the middle, is it possible there'll be a major technological breakthrough, for example, a solar panel covering sub-Sahara Africa, so Africa would not only meet its own electricity needs, but export it to Europe?
Okay, thank you. The lady right there.
So my question is related to the AFCFTA. It's, an exciting topic at the moment. When I think about my grandfather's Africa, I can think of other policies that seemed, like they would be obviously good ideas and didn't have positive consequences. The same thing probably comes to all our minds. And I hear excitement here. I'm wondering what you are seeing, what sort of analysis you're looking at to inform the positivity about it. Because when I think about it, I'm Nigerian, and I can understand the reluctance for the Nigerian government to sign it when I think about trade diversion or the ideas that there may be winners or losers. So I'm wondering what you're seeing, what analysis you're looking at.
Okay, did you get that one? Okay.
Okay, thank you. I'm Marine Sciencer, Georgetown University. Several of the panelists have alluded to the question of human mobility, which when associated with forced displacement, tends to be related to instability, and for good reason. But I think that we need to also consider the positive opportunities. I've worked with refugees and returnees and IDPs from a large number of African countries, both within Africa and in the diaspora. And without failing to recognize the tremendous challenges, what I've witnessed has often left me with a sense of expanded possibilities. Okay? After all, the refugee experience is a cross-cultural experience with all the positive connotations that entails. And so my question for anyone in the panel would be, do you have any thoughts for the constructive roles that Africans across borders could potentially make to contribute to all these transformations you've been discussing? Thank you.
Okay. Sir, final word right here.
Andre J. Babu with Congo Diaspora Network. So I will ask just the specifics, especially to Mrs. Ambassador and Dr. Samuel. When you're talking about the Democratic Republic of Congo today, I know Ms. Ambassador mentioned China and Russia, being another aspect of, coming to Africa as far as the business opportunity and all that. But I would like to know, for instance, from the Ambassador, what type of effort have you personally made when you were dealing with Africa with some of the situation of some of the big names that we know of the multinational, as well as some buyer of the fund that already been there, creating the situation that my sister here has been exposing when it comes to underemployment, unemployment, the youth over there. So then, when it comes to Dr. Samuel,
One question.
yes, yeah, it's all one question, So I would like to know, like, in your organization, what type of, clear aspect that you can bring out, with your real background, as an African, when it comes to the organization being involved, supposedly, inside this whole situation. But then, we're having all the consequences, like this other lady here exposed, because we have that situation right now with some of the Congolese coming through the border in the south. So, yeah.
All right, so those are two very personal questions, the way I heard them. There were a number of questions, but let me just reframe because they were very targeted. Jenda, your question is from a personal perspective. What are you doing to help highlight and bring this transformation to the forefront? That's probably something you could answer offline, but he asked in a public forum, so I'm reframing and putting it over to you.
Okay.
Samuel, yours was you're an African working within the World Bank, all right? World Bank's engagement in Africa has not always been positive, right? So what are you doing to help transform that institution?
I'm here.
All right. And then there were the other questions about Africans across borders contributing to the transformation, and the question from my sister over there that I think you all got, and then the questions about the energy question. So here's what I'm going to do. We can continue this discussion afterwards because we sign off in exactly 2 minutes. They stopped recording out there. So I'm not even going to go. I typically do a summary. I will forego that because I think you all have been fantastic. You should have the last word. So in 30 seconds, and I mean 30 seconds because otherwise they're coming after me, just answer one of the questions or leave us with your final thought on this whole issue of the way Africa is transformation. So I'll literally go in this way. So Nami, 30 seconds right now.
I think on the governance issue, we have long underestimated the role of women in peacekeeping processes. And I think what the US can do if the will of the people is there, but the government isn't, is to engage the already existing regional instruments that are working towards peace processes. For example, we have the African Union Envoy on Women, Peace and Security. She could use the support, the African Envoy on Youth, because those are the people that reach the locals and they reach the grassroots. So I think in terms of support, that is an entry point towards that point. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Travis?
Yes, I would just close by addressing the question on migration and people moving across borders in Africa. The positive aspects of it, I think one thing I would point out is just the kind of micro-localization of it. And so often when we hear about refugees, there's this notion of people who've walked thousands of miles, when in many instances, as you will know, people have maybe only walked 1 mile or 2 miles. And even though they're crossing what we consider a border, they don't necessarily consider it a border. They're returning to their kith and kin who are across those borders, engaged in trade, commerce, and other types of relations which contribute to all of the countries in which they can be found. So,
thank you. Joe?
I would just pick up on the refugee question as well, that I think there's a difference between economic migrants and refugees, and the refugees are the ones who don't want to leave, and so we should be engaging in ways that help them to go back home. But yes, migration and movement can be a positive thing economically, and we should look at ways of facilitating that, making it transparent and organized so that it benefits all sides.
Thank you. Samuel, the tough question.
Yeah. I grew up in Zambia when it was going through a World Bank and IMF structural adjustment program when I was an undergraduate student. I hated the institution. I rioted. I went on rallies. I had longer hair, Marxist to the core. So I joined the bank with a lot of trepidation. Since then, I've been pleasantly surprised with how open and democratic internally the bank is. And so what I do is exactly, I was half joking when I said, come here, so that when people say Nigeria is a lost cause, it's oil revenue, and it's spoiling its oil revenue, I point to the data and so say that Nigeria actually grew because it's invested in agriculture. We never talk about agriculture in Nigeria, but it is there. And so my role is to shine the light on the data that allows Africa to tell its own story. Thank you.
I'll answer the question in a couple of ways, but quickly. One, I work with the MasterCard Foundation. You're asking about Unami's questions about youth and unemployment and what am I doing. I'm a director on the MasterCard Foundation board, and we've launched a program called Young Africa Works. I would suggest that you look it up on the internet. MasterCard Foundation is a $21 billion foundation, one of the largest in the world. All of those resources are focused on Africa. And our entire next 10-year strategy is focused on youth employment issues. I also am on the board of Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and we do an annual on the Now Generation Forum so that young people can be at the table talking about their future now as decision makers. And so that's another way in which I help. I also am the managing partner of 2 commodity exchanges, one in Rwanda and Nigeria. Both of them are led by young Africans who are 40 years and under, and they employ about 200 or so people. And so as a businesswoman, I also am very much focused on the issues of employment and growing the economies. And what I would just final say there is that there needs to be a level playing field so that the private sector can actually flourish. And when I say a level playing field, I don't mean American companies with Chinese companies, which is what most people talk about. I'm talking about also for African companies.
Cynthia, 30 seconds. Bring us home.
Yes, and I'll do that by answering the question on the Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think the excitement is really around the potential that it holds. Wherever you look at the EU, the Asian economies, intra-regional integration has been the key to those regions developing and growing. Currently, 44 countries, African countries, have signed up to it. And for me, I think moving forward, the key issues really will be the practicalities now, issues of the rules of origin, to address your question, issues of customs facilitation, the trade facilitation. Those are the issues that will determine whether or not it becomes successful, going back again to policy coherence implementation. Thank you.
All right. This has been a fantastic session.
Yes.
I think what our speakers and your audience have contributed to this is really give us what we were looking for. A sense of not just the overwhelming gloom and challenge that many people see to be Africa, but what they've succeeded in doing is highlighting some of the change, the transformation, the trends and trajectories on positive stuff that's taking place on the continent. But also they highlighted some of the challenges that they can see in the road ahead. That was very important. We just don't want to talk about the good without acknowledging the bad and the challenges. And I think our speakers did a fantastic job of really walking us through their analysis on the key issues and the key developments that are transforming Africa today. I think a second point that our speakers did so well is to really point out for us, and it was interesting to me, and I won't say who's who, but we had people from both sides of the aisle on this panel, really talking about how our policy engagement as the United States can be and needs to be more robust. I think that came through very, very powerfully. And I know we had some policymakers in the audience, so I hope you're taking some of that away and rethinking how we do engagement and how we can do a better job or a stronger job and a much healthier job on that front. I want to conclude on the last point, that too often we focus on the big picture, what we're doing at the government level. And I like that my brother here asked the question on the personal. We each have a personal obligation to tell this story or to help tell this story. You're here because you know Africa. You're here because you know that the story that is told about Africa is only half a story, if that. And so challenging us to think not just at the institutions and the governance level, but at that personal level about what can you do from your perch, whether it's an office in USAID, whether it's in your church, in your community, whether it's for an NGO that you work for, whatever it is. That, for me, was a very powerful point on which to end this discussion. Like, don't just put the responsibility on those who have in office, elected officials. What can we do as private citizens? And with that, I ask that you join me in thanking our fantastic panel. And I thank all of you as well for contributing to this discussion. And I want to thank the Wilson Center team, both Big Wilson and the Africa program, Hannah, Ian, Sharazad, Gamu, as well as our wonderful interns, Paul, James, and Corinthians, for really helping us manage all of this and bring it together. And to all of you, we have the final Brown Capital Management Africa Forum event in this series in November. We have looked at U.S.-Africa economic engagement at the federal level. In November, we'll probably have about 10 states here that are engaging with Africa in the economic space. So we can better understand what's happening at the state level and how we can help to boost that engagement, tap into that engagement and amplify it, but also share lessons learned and experiences across states. So we hope you'll join us for that event in November. For now, I invite you all to join us for a mini reception where we can continue the discussion. But while the rest of you go out into the mini reception, I'd like to ask our speakers and Brown Capital Management team to join us on the stage for the official photo, and then we'll join everybody up there. So thank you.